Good evening. This is Vernon Lee Jr. with the Hampton Roads Youth Foundation and co-host of the 757 Roundtable. Carl, we have had a lot of support in the last 24 plus years from so many people in the community, but there's one person in particular that has showed up and showed out on numerous occasions that, I mean, beyond grateful, to both of us. So to have him on tonight, I think is really special. You want to introduce him?
Absolutely. This gentleman honestly needs no introduction to us. Coming from the Hampton Roads area growing up, there was only one person that we connected with and identified as our leader, particularly in the political arena, because our parents would not let us listen to and hear from anyone else but this gentleman. And so it is a dear delight and treat to have Congressman Bobby Scott join us this evening from the Hampton Roads area district. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Congressman Scott. Really, it's just an honor to have you on. Seriously, it's really an honor.
Well, good. It's good to be here. Thank you. And it's good to be here with Vernon. You said that we grew up looking at, I grew up with his father, played tennis a lot, even in at Huntington Park, when we started at what was then World War II, and now Dory Miller Recreational Center, and had a good time. So it's good to be with you. And delighted that you're helping our youth, because that's our next generation. That's going to make quite a difference. And to the extent that we can focus on our youth, our future looks good.
Absolutely.
We appreciate that. So Congressman Scott, could you tell, people know the name and, you've got a big annual event and have been very active in the community, but what was your upbringing like? Where did you grow up? What's your story?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I grew up actually, when I was in elementary school, I grew up in 800 block of 32nd Street, about half a block from what used to be Dory Miller, now is the Scott Center. And I could hear the Huntington band playing early in the morning during football season. So then we moved to Madison Avenue and now on Shore Drive, where you alluded to the annual event, the Labor Day Cookout that we've had since 1977. Because of the pandemic, we couldn't hold it in real life this time, so we had it virtual, and we had a lot of people, starting with Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and other figures from across the political spectrum, state, local, and federal, to come in and say a few words and talk about the importance of voting. So we had a virtual cookout. Hopefully the pandemic will be well under control next year so we can get back to having it in person. We've had a great success with it. President Clinton came one year. We've had, they say no matter how important you think you are, the number of people at your funeral will depend on the weather. Well, the number of people at the cookout depends on the weather. So it's anything from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand. And so we've always had a good time. Come one, come all.
Absolutely. Congressman Scott, I want to talk a little bit about your education, because as I mentioned, and I'm very sincere when I say this, growing up in the Hampton Roads area, you were our guiding light in terms of whatever laws were passed, how we lived our lives daily from a political standpoint in the Hampton Roads area. And you being from right from the downtown area of Newport News, Virginia, and then you going on to college, because you went to, can you tell us high school you went to and college?
When they started closing the schools to avoid integration, my father I went to boarding school in Massachusetts. Okay. They ended up in Newport News not closing the schools, but they did close them in Norfolk. They closed them in Prince Edward County. That's where the Brown v. Board of Education case, Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County, where they actually closed the schools for 4 years. It's interesting that the language in the Brown decision is, it is doubtful that any child may be reasonably expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity is a right, where the state provides it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. Well, Virginia looked at that where the state provides it and decided rather than integrate the schools, they just wouldn't provide any education. So when the court ordered them to integrate, they just closed the schools. In Prince Edward County, a couple of years, Charlottesville, they closed the schools, one in Northern Virginia. And they finally decided to comply with the Brown v. Board of Education. But by then I was already up in boarding school in Massachusetts. I went to Harvard and Boston College Law School. In the afternoon, I got my degree from Boston College Law School. That afternoon, I drove to Charlottesville to take the bar review course, took the bar exam, and came back. And that summer, since you really can't get a job after you've taken the bar exam until you get the results, and it takes about 3 months to get the results. Because if you need a law license for the job, you don't have one. If you don't need a license and they hire you, you know as soon as you get your results back, you're gonna quit and go get a better job. So you really can't do much. So I ended up teaching tennis at what is now World War II. Had a good time, and that's where I met a lot of the people. Started playing tennis with Vernon's father and others in some of the tennis tournaments that our church sponsored. But that was when I came back right after law school, I got very much involved. I was involved in Jesse Radley's campaign for re-election in 1974. I got involved in the Democratic Party after that. I started, you look around, there's so much that needed to be done. As a lawyer, I recognized that a lot of people couldn't afford lawyers. So I was primarily responsible for bringing the legal aid program that's here now. It started out as the Peninsula Legal Aid Program. It has subsequently joined up with the Southampton Roads Legal Aid. So it's a much larger program now, but it started on the Peninsula in about 1976, 77. I ran for the House of Delegates in 77. If I knew then what I know now, I would know that I could not win. But I was burdened with that knowledge and wisdom and ran and won. And served in the House of Delegates for 5 years, State Senate for 10 years, and been in Congress since 1992. One of the things I've been trying to focus on are the kinds of things you've been focusing on, making sure that young people have the opportunities, can get on the right track and stay on the right track. Our entire criminal justice system is traditionally wait until they drop out of school, join a gang, get caught, and then jump up on a soapbox and get into a bidding war, and who can say how much more time they're gonna get, and whether it's mandatory, and take the discretion from the judges and just lock them up and throw away the key. Who can be the toughest on crime? That doesn't do anything to reduce crime. All that does is just load up the prisons, and you can see that strategy, regrettably, codifying simple-minded slogans and sound bites, is all it's done is gotten us to the point where we lead the world in incarceration. We got 5% of the world's population, about 20-some% of the world's prisoners. We can do better than that. If you just follow the evidence, you can reduce crime and save money in the process. Interesting, Texas was an interesting case study because a couple of years ago, their appropriations committee was told that they needed $2 billion, $2 billion with a B, $2 billion, one state, in new prison money to keep up with the growing prison population. And somebody said, well, ooh, man, that's a lot of money. Well, how about if we tried to spend some of that on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation according to the evidence first, and then see what happens? Well, they tried. They spent about $200 million, about 10% of it, on prevention, youth programs, after-school programs, crime prevention programs, rehabilitation, early intervention. And they looked up and they had reduced crime so much that they didn't need to build any new prisons. In fact, they were able to close some of the prisons they had. Well, that creates a nice coalition because you got everybody that likes a humane criminal justice system focused on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, and all the money that don't care about criminal justice, but care about saving money, they just saved almost $2 billion. And they're working together. They were able to have to initiate a lot of new laws, eliminating mandatory minimums, reducing penalties, diversion programs like drug courts, do more in the juvenile area, do more juvenile programs and education and dropout programs to get young people on the right track and keep them on the right track, the kind of things that you're doing, rather than waiting for them to mess up and then just lock them up and throw away the key. And so that's been my focus since I've been in public office. And we're finally getting to the point where I think people are seeing that. Joe Biden, everybody knows, was the sponsor of the '94 crime bill, which was all lock them up and throw away the key. I was on the crime subcommittee when that thing passed, and I was the lead opponent of the thing, fighting it tooth and nail. And interestingly enough, they couldn't get that thing out of committee because I was so successful in hanging it up. The Republicans didn't like it because it was a Democratic bill. And we had enough, I had enough Democrats, I had John Conyers from Detroit, and Mel Watt, my best friend from North Carolina, and Craig Washington from Houston, all members of the Black Caucus. We had Javier Becerra, who is now the Attorney General in California, and all fighting against it, and they couldn't get that thing out of committee. They said that's going to be the first bill that the president signs. And then, well, we're going to do it by Memorial Day. Well, by 4th of July, we're going to have this bill out of committee. By Labor Day, it was almost Labor Day the next year before they finally figured out how to get around us and get that thing passed. Wow. But that was the strategy for crime. Not only was Joe involved in that, but 2/3 of the Black Caucus voted for it. We couldn't talk them out of it because it was good politics. But slowly and surely, one of the guys that voted for it, by the way, is on public record saying it's the dumbest vote he cast in the 20-some years he's been in Congress. So, you know, people are changing. Yeah. But I think we've got, if you look at the Democratic platform this year, under Joe Biden, it is a progressive platform. Get rid of the mandatory minimums, put more money into prevention and early intervention. All the kind of things that we've been fighting for all these years, people are finally coming around. And if we can get Joe Biden elected, I think it will be the most progressive criminal justice system that we've had in history. Now, we're not voting for Joe 25 years ago. We're not voting for him in 1994. We're voting in 2020. We'll have a different attitude in 1994, but this is 2020. And we've got a very progressive attitude. And I think the youth programs will be one of the things that are targeted for support, because we know that if we can get them on the right track and keep them on the right track, like I said, the kind of things you're doing, they don't need to be in trouble. If they got constructive things to do, and people make choices. If somebody joins a gang, what in the world were the other choices? I mean, if this is the best thing on the table, if he joined a gang, it's not his fault, it's our fault.
Right.
There should have been more things on the table. He said, well, let me join a gang because I know it's all downhill from there. Just look at where gang members are in their late 20s, if they're still alive, or you get a good education, you can make something out of yourself. You are putting people on the right track, and all the youth programs, that's where the money needs to be spent. And you look up, you save so much money in future incarceration, future law enforcement expenses, that you save more money than you spend. And so criminal justice has been one of the areas that I've been really active in. I'm sorry.
No, that's, you hit on some key things, and like right out of the gate, which we love. And you talked about the election, and you talked about youth involvement. I mean, what are some things that, you know, I think a lot of our viewers are sort of in the high school, college in terms of youth, some of the former campers and things of that nature. But with the upcoming election, and not just from a presidential standpoint, but even with local election, what are the things that some of the youth should be thinking about or considering now, maybe even first-time voters that are, that are 18, and then a little bit beyond the election day, because I think that's something that, and this is just Vernon speaking, after President Obama was elected, I think everyone thought magic was going to happen, but a lot of the hard work started afterwards. So maybe Congressman Scott, in terms of leading up to the election, I know get out the vote is a big effort, but even after election day, should some of the youth be thinking about and parents be having conversations around in terms of?
Well, first of all, you got to slow up about skipping past election day. Elections have consequences. Once the election takes place, a lot of stuff is already laid out and it's too late. You got to wait till the next election to fix it. And you can just look at gun safety. Last year, Democrats made gun safety an issue, and they took over the House of Delegates and State Senate. Prior to that, a gun background check bill, you couldn't get it out of subcommittee in the General Assembly because the Republicans had control. That was the election. You would have protest people coming out protesting, all the liberals coming out, the Moms Against Demand Action, all the groups coming out protesting, filling up the Capitol Square. And what good did it do? None. They couldn't get that thing out of subcommittee. And then we took over. And then guess what happened? All the gun people came out and filled up Capitol Square with all their assault weapons and everything else, scaring people to death. And what difference did it make? None, because we wouldn't pass those bills anyway and send them to the governor. Background checks and other things to make sure that we make a little progress. Didn't solve all the problems, but made a little progress on gun safety. So once the election is over, yeah, there are things to do, but the elections have consequences. And so when you talk about policing, it's really all politics. The local chief of police didn't fall out of the sky. He was selected through the political process. The city council selects the city manager. City manager picks the police chief, and the city manager isn't going to do anything that the city council doesn't like because they're at will. I mean, the city council changes its mind, gone. And so the city manager is going to reflect the views of the city council and do what the city council wants done. And so what kind of city manager, so what kind of chief of police do you have? Do you have a chief of police that's going to be cracking heads, that's going to tolerate profiling, that's going to tolerate shooting people? Are you going to be having an oppression-based strategy, or can't we all get along strategy? I think you've seen in Chief Drew, he's trying to, can't we all get along, work with people? And the same in Hampton, Chief Sue, trying to work with people. And in Norfolk, you see the same thing. And it makes a difference. We don't need to protest because we can talk to the chief of police. When we have a protest march after George Floyd, the chiefs of police in Newport News, Hampton, and Norfolk, half the time they're in the procession with us.
Right.
And so we need to make sure that you have that kind of police officer rather than the kind of police officer that's going to tolerate a lot of nonsense. Now, like I said, elections have consequences. Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of Minnesota. He got elected in a very close election a couple of years ago. He's a former member of the Congressional Black Caucus, so I know him well. He's a great guy. He got elected in a close election. After the George Floyd situation, a little while after the situation, he took over the prosecution. First thing he did was enhance the charges on the first officer and had the other three arrested. Okay, what would have happened if he had lost that close election? Well, elections have consequences. And so a lot of this is political. The decisions you make are political, and the bills you can pass are political. The House, the Democratic House, passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. It bans chokeholds. It bans no-knock warrants. That was Breonna Taylor's situation where they just busted in the house, surprised people, and the shootout occurred. Chokeholds, that's George Floyd. It's bans racial profiling. It creates national standards. Why should every sheriff and police chief make up its own standards when it comes to requiring de-escalation and implicit bias training, and things like use of force? When is it appropriate to use force? Why do you ought to have some national standards on these? It requires collection of a lot of data, and it allows police officers to be held accountable civilly or, if necessary, criminally for misconduct. That passed the House. Went over to the Senate. We haven't seen it since, because the Senate has a Republican majority. McConnell is deciding what gets brought up and what doesn't. He won't bring it up. Nancy Pelosi brought it up. And so, like I said, elections have consequences, and the George Floyd, if we get a good vote in the Senate coming up, that bill can become, and somebody they'll sign the bill, the president they'll sign it, that bill can become law. Now, if we lose the presidential or don't take over the Senate, you can forget about police accountability legislation. And protesting might help. If you have a good result, protesting will help, because it will remind the ones we elected how they got there and what they're expected to do. But if the other side wins, I mean, you know, it's just tough. You do the best you can, but it's just tough. You got healthcare. How did one party get in favor of healthcare, the other party not in favor of healthcare? After Obamacare passed, the Republicans spent the last 10 years trying to kill it, trying to sabotage it. And you go back to where healthcare was when we passed Obamacare. Costs were going through the roof, doubling about every 5 or 8 years. The cost doubling about 5 to 8 years. Millions of people every year were losing their insurance. Millions. People with pre-existing conditions couldn't get insurance. So if they did, you paid for it. There were no minimum benefits. So the insurance you got might not cover what you have. There were caps. The insurance policy would only pay over your lifetime so much. You've got people over the Children's Hospital neonatal intensive care unit, newborn babies, who reach their cap before they go home. They are uninsurable the rest of their life. All that solved by Obamacare. Women aren't paying more than men anymore. And the Republicans have tried to kill it time and time again. And it's all political. I mean, it's called Obamacare, and they get people all whipped up into a frenzy. We got to kill Obamacare. And they were just reveling in the politics of it all, because people would come out to kill Obamacare. You know, they were against Obamacare, but if you call it the Affordable Care Act, it had a lot more support. Now, go figure.
That's right. Yep. I remember. Yep.
Right, Michael, you realize it's the same.
Okay, so you know what's going on.
Yes.
And so they benefited from getting people all whipped up all this years. And then Trump got elected with the Republican House and the Republican Senate. Somebody says, okay, y'all been complaining, where's your bill? And they came up with a bill, and it passed the House. Unfortunately for them, the Congressional Budget Office did what we call scored the bill. They evaluated and said what it would do. They said, if that thing became law, costs would go up 20% the first year. 20-some million fewer people would have insurance. Your protections against pre-existing conditions would start evaporating. And because they don't have minimum standards for benefits, the insurance you get probably be worse than what you already have. They passed it. Yay! And went to celebrate in the Rose Garden about what they had done. Thankfully, John McCain killed it
Oh, yeah, that's right.
at the last minute.
Yep.
And it's not law now. But now you've got the Supreme Court vacancy, where they said 4 years ago, oh, you can't fill a vacancy in an election year. I mean, every youth in your organization can tell you, if you establish the principle you can't fill a vacancy in an election year, 4 years later, in an election year, closer to the election, what should you do? How many of your young people would say, well, if you got the votes, you should go for it? No, they would say, well, if you didn't do it 4 years ago, you shouldn't do it now. That's just basic fairness. They're not only going for it, they're rushing it, because there is a case being heard by the Supreme Court the week after the election that has the potential of eliminating the entire Affordable Care Act, all the affordability credits, all the pre-existing conditions protections, women not paying more than men protection, all the protections of the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid expansion that's covering over 400,000 people in Virginia, gone. She has been, there was a Supreme Court case a few years ago, Justice Roberts switched sides and joined the liberals, and it was preserved. This nominee wrote articles and was quoted as being critical against that vote. So there's every expectation that they're going to kill the Affordable Care Act. Now, this is where elections have consequences. Whatever the Supreme Court does to it, we have the president, the Senate, and the House, we can fix it. But if the Republicans have either the Senate, or I think Democrats can retain the House. If they keep the Senate or the White House, they have no incentive of doing anything. Whatever damage the Supreme Court does will be damage, and that will be a consequence of this election. So your health care is very much at stake, depending on what happens in this election. And after the election, I mean, we can lobby and cajole and, but, if they're in control, that's it. They hate the Affordable Care Act. They have benefited, they've benefited politically by calling it Obamacare, getting people all whipped up, and benefited, lied about whether they had a plan to protect pre-existing conditions. They don't. The only bill that passed the House, all their legislation, and I remember when a couple of days ago, Senator Cruz said, "Oh, we all support the protection for those with pre-existing conditions." I mean, that was just an astounding statement, because a bunch of Republican senators signed what they call amicus briefs. That's a brief to the court in support of the case to throw it all out. And I'm sure he was on that list. And he's been voting for stuff to do it away. But the fact that he would say it in a hearing, filling a vacancy in the Supreme Court when they said they wouldn't do it, is conclusive evidence that his word is not good. So when he promises to protect people with pre-existing condition, while he's sitting in a lie, he's sitting in a hearing, filling a vacancy they said they wouldn't fill. Trust me, I'm gonna protect you with pre-existing conditions. Only a fool would believe that. But elections have consequences. If this side wins, it'll be a mess. But healthcare is extremely important, and if we get the right votes, we can improve on the Affordable Care Act. There are improvements we can make. It wasn't perfect. There's still some problems need to be solved. We didn't cause the problems. We just didn't get around to solving them. But we can solve a lot of the problems with if we get the votes. And there are a lot of little things we can do to improve on the Affordable Care Act.
You know what, Congressman Scott, you just answered the question that I was going to ask, because I want to talk to those viewers who are not as confident in the political process. And I think they are, and I'm a realist in this, that we are tapping the conscience of a lot of new voters for the first time, which is a good thing. But they're still a little skeptical on politics, because politics, if you're not in it, you could be a little skeptical on it because, maybe you thought that your vote counted and it actually didn't, so to speak, in the last election. But I love the way you just broke down very simple steps and very relatable areas for viewers and community folks to see how important it is to vote and be a part of the political process. As Vernon mentioned, I want to get your perspective because you have been involved in youth, and I've watched you from afar just dive into the culture and the tap into the conscience of young people, particularly at our 18 to 21 age frame. How can we continue to motivate, encourage them to be a part of it, even if they're not as in tuned to the vast political process as it may, like myself, Vernon, who are a little older, but how can we tap into their conscience to get them to understand that it's not only part of your civic duty, but it's a part of your whole culture and the way your life is going to, become one day when you become old like me and Vernon. How can we encourage them to be involved and get motivated?
Well, first of all, if they're not a little skeptical, they're not paying attention. So you should be a little skeptical, particularly when people are trying to steal your vote.
Right.
And even that has your right to vote. Elections have consequences. The Republicans have an open strategy of suppressing the vote. And you look at all these, I think I heard about 300 lawsuits around the country about various aspects about whether the state has to accept a ballot that comes in after the election, if it's supposed to mark the day of the election. I mean, little things like that. You got all the Democrats on the side of all the votes ought to be counted, and all the Republicans on the side of count as few votes as possible. If you look at what the Republicans in the General Assembly were doing for years, restrictive voter ID, things like that, as soon as the Democrats came in, because we elected them, the first thing they did was watered down the voter ID. It doesn't have to be a photo ID; it can be all kinds of ID in order to vote. Early vote. The fact that you can vote now, as you're watching this podcast, you should have already voted. And if you haven't voted, get out there and vote. Just go to the registrar's office and vote. You can also ask for an absentee. You can ask for an absentee ballot. You can send in an absentee ballot form. They'll send you a ballot, and you can mail it in, or you can take it in and put it in the Dropbox, or you can wait till Election Day, November 3rd. The best thing to do is to vote early and get it over with. You don't know what the weather is going to be like on Election Day, or what your employment situation. I mean, there are all kinds of employers in the old days who would offer people overtime on Election Day. Mm. And so they couldn't get to the polls. And I mean, that was just routine. I mean, that's just who they are. That's just who they are. And so you don't know what the situation, but if you vote early, because we have early vote, and then there's a provision where if you mail in a vote and there's something wrong with it and it doesn't count, you have an opportunity to fix it. They'll get in touch with you. You can come in. If you didn't sign it, you can sign it. I mean, all kinds of things to expand the vote. But you're talking about why young people ought to be paying attention. Let me tell you, old people are paying attention to the fact that too many young people aren't voting, right, and they're stealing the money. Exactly. I mean, there's what I call generational theft. You remember a couple of years ago when Bernie Sanders said, "How about free college?" And somebody says, "Well, how much is that going to cost?" He said, $900 billion. And everybody started laughing. I mean, that number was so big as to raise questions about, how is this man going to run for president spending that kind of money? $900 billion. Okay, remember that number. First thing Trump did was passed a tax cut. $1.5 trillion. $1.5 trillion. And 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. Okay. Let's see what we could have done. Could we have afforded free college? If you're going to spend 1.5 trillion, 80% of the benefits go to the top 1% in corporations. Maybe could we have afforded free college? Okay, first of all, let's do a little budgeting. You got 1.5 trillion. 0.3 trillion is all you need to give 99% of the people what they got. Okay. 0.1 trillion, you can pass my Rebuild America Schools Act that will produce many times more jobs than the tax cut bill. For 0.2 trillion, you can end homelessness in America. Okay, and what do you have left? 0.9. 0.9 trillion is $900 billion. You can do all that and have left over enough for free college. Or you can give it to the top 1% in corporations. Choices are being made. Now, first choice is whether you're going to spend that kind of money, whether you can afford it or not, but let's assume we're going to spend 1.5 trillion. Us old people spent 1.5 trillion, 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. I think most of the people watching this podcast would have said, well, how about give 99% of the people what they would have gotten, which includes everybody watching this podcast. Plus, how about some more jobs and improve education, and let's end homelessness, and then do free college. Same money. Now, since young people aren't voting, who's for free college? Now, when they start voting, you're going to start getting different decisions being made. Oh, by the way, to add insult to injury, the $1.5 trillion was all borrowed money that the young people that didn't vote are going to have to pay.
Pay it back, right?
Right, the long term.
So we're going to ask the young people to pay for the $1.5 trillion tax cut, when for the same amount of money, they could have gotten free college, end homelessness, more jobs, and for 99% of the people, the same tax cut they would have gotten anyway. Now, the only thing that makes that possible are young people not voting. And so, to the extent that they don't vote, now, what did Frederick Douglass say? You don't get everything you fight for, but you're going to fight for everything you get.
Right.
You can't let stuff like this go without having something to say about it. And that just passed. People did not comprehend that we were borrowing money that young people are going to pay off and stealing money that could have gone to their college education. Just college education generally. I chair the Education and Labor Committee. Higher education. When I was in school, states were paying about 2/3 of the cost of state colleges. Pell Grant paid about 75 to 85% of the cost of going to college. The little bit that may have been left, you could work job waiting tables and work your way through college, no debt. Now, instead of 2/3, it's about 1/3 on average nationally that the states are paying for college. And the Pell Grant is paying about 30%, hadn't kept up with inflation. So how do you pay the rest? You can work 40 hours a week and still can't go to school without debt. That's where all the student debt is coming from. How did that happen? Because we've been cutting taxes for old people that are voting and laying the debt onto the young people that aren't voting. Now, when young people start voting, we're going to cut that out. We're going to put more money into education to reduce the cost. That bill that came out of committee hadn't passed and won't pass this year. But if we get the right people next year, the College Affordability Act can pass. Biggest increase in Pell Grants in the history of the program. increased with inflation, so that it'll keep growing. But mostly, you could be able to go to college and come out with no debt if you're willing to work 15 hours a week. If you're not willing to work, well, a little bit of debt. But you can go to college. First 2 years free, to community college or an HBCU. I mean, we can do this, and we won't spend any more money on that. We'll spend about a third of the money on that than they did on the tax cut. These are the choices we're making, and young people aren't voting, so they're putting no pressure on the people making the decisions as to which side they ought to be on. When young people start voting, when they start coming out in droves, there's no question about whether or not these massive tax cuts for the rich can pass, as opposed to let's put some more money to reduce the cost of college. And it's not just college, it's college, community college, job training, and other kinds of opportunities that will increase your skills, Job Corps, the kinds of things that you can get into and increase your job possibilities. The community colleges have a series of little programs, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 16 weeks, where you take this little course and you can get, you can increase your salary 25, 50, 100%. But it costs a couple $1,000. So why can't you can't use a Pell Grant on it, because you can only use a Pell Grant for a course that leads to a college degree. If all it leads to is a good job, can't use a Pell Grant. Why?
Right.
You ought to be able to use a Pell, if it definitely is going to lead to a good job, why can't you use a Pell Grant to increase your skills? Those are the kind of things that we're looking at to give opportunities to young people, but we're having trouble passing them because the young people aren't voting. The old people, all they're whining about is tax cuts, not investments in college. So we're betting that the young people are going to come out and vote. They're going to come out and vote for criminal justice reform and policing. They're coming out for education and healthcare, and for budgeting that makes sense for them. And they will come out and vote for it. And then you're not going to win everything. You're not going to get everything you vote for, but you're going to vote for everything you get. And you can certainly make a big difference in the kinds of decisions that are made in Washington.
Congressman Scott, so you obviously you hit on something that's obviously near and dear to us in terms of education with a lot of the student athletes we've had at the camp over the years and programs, not just football players, but student athletes in general. One of the messages just so happens that the NFL players and Coach Tomlin, when they come back, they're always driving this message about, hey, use football as an opportunity to get your education. So we've always driven that. And so you've given, I think even for myself around this particular bill and some of the nuances associated with that, I think we've collectively seen this trend for, and again, young people generally, but very active in social media around whether it's Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, and an active engagement of sharing where I've seen, hey, call this number or text to this representative, whether it's an attorney general or your congressman. I've seen a lot more of that over the last couple of months. Could you talk about that maybe in general, how effective that is in terms of whether young people to parents, and particularly around, I am interested about your particular bill, because to me, it seems like a no-brainer to provide opportunities, especially coming out of this pandemic.
Well, first of all, on educational opportunities, we do not want to limit college opportunities just to exceptional athletes.
That's exactly.
It's not that exceptional athletes will have unique opportunities, but they should not be the only ones that have an opportunity to go to college. And they'll have unique opportunities because they'll be able to get full rides, and if they're really exceptional professional sports. But if you look at the number of people in high school sports and the number of people in college sports and the number of people that make it to the pros, the chance that a
Very
particular
small.
high school is going to produce somebody that's going to the NFL, that is not it's a good strategy for the one exceptional player, and you've had several on your podcast. I mean, it happens, but it's not a good strategy for the whole class. We need opportunities so the whole class can go to college and get a reasonable get a college degree, or if they're not going to a 4-year liberal arts degree, to get job training so they can skills trainings. And there are a lot of good jobs, apprenticeships, a lot of good jobs where they can pursue a nice middle class or upper middle class income. We should not limit that opportunity. And it's just a question of voting. And you talked about lobbying after the fact. When we receive messages from constituents, the calculation we make is what effect will this have on my next election? If you hear from a few random people, probably not a lot. But if those random people get involved with the NAACP or other organizations that are active in particular areas, if it's an environment, there are a lot of environmental groups, you get involved with them. When they communicate, they can affect elections. I mean, the NAACP on a national basis, the Washington Bureau has a program where if you sign up and if you go to NAACP.org, I think it's .org, it might be a .net, but if you Google NAACP and go to that website, there's a Washington Bureau, and they have an alert system where they will send out an email a couple of days before a bill comes up saying the bill's coming up. We want you to encourage your legislator to vote no. And then after all the voting is over, at the end of the year, they will produce what's called a scorecard. All the bills they took a position on, they'll say what the legislators did. Now, frankly, I vote on hundreds of bills every year, and I really only have to explain a dozen or two. Now, if I know I've got to explain it, I'm going to spend a lot more time looking at who's for it and who's against it. And if the NAACP has taken a position for it and nobody's against it, that tells me how I ought to vote, because I'm gonna have to explain this to somebody. And so if people would go on to the Washington Bureau NAACP website and sign up, they will get an alert before the bill comes up. Now, if you read about it in the paper, this is the problem with individuals. If you read about it in the paper, it's already too late. They've already voted. They're writing about what happened.
That's right.
But if you are on the alert system, you get to notify your legislator beforehand. And it also empowers the lobbyist. Hillary Shelton is the lobbyist for the NAACP. When he comes and says, we need you to vote for this, I know that there are hundreds of people in my district that are going to get his alert before the bill comes up. So I need to pay attention to what he's saying so I know how to vote. Now, I got 100% rating with NAACP, so I'm not afraid of Hillary. Some of the other groups, I'm not as good with. Depending, they're trying to take your rights away. I'm not as good with them. But that's one group that shows how you can actively be involved. You've got to get involved in groups, and find a group that has as its mission the kinds of things you're interested in, and they'll usually guide you pretty well. If you're interested in preserving the environment, there are a lot of environmental groups, and if you're hearing from them their legislative agenda and recommended votes, you know what their mission is, so you know they're going to be on the right side. Other groups that are against the environment or for issues that you're opposing, when they come out for something, you're supposed to be on the other side. So you can get a signal from organizations based on what you know about their mission, and that's a good tip-off as to how you need to vote. But get involved in groups. My recommendation would also be get involved with party apparatus, because that's how you get the vote out and get the right people elected.
And Congressman Scott, this will be our last, because we know you have a busy schedule, so we want to thank you, but this will be our last question. I wanted to kind of round it up with an act that I follow very closely, that you had passed, and you supported the Youth Promise Act that we are connected to because of what we do in the Hampton Roads community. And I want you to kind of talk about that a little bit, because I'm empowered. It really gave Vernon and myself some motivation to start the Hampton Roads Youth Foundation and continue our efforts based around some of the items that are in this act. And can you talk a little bit about the Youth Promise Act?
The Youth Promise Act is premised on the idea that if you get young people on the right track and keep them on the right track, that you'll have a much better result than if you wait for them to mess up and then spend all your money on criminal justice system, particularly incarceration. In fact, that has been the strategy all along, because it's been good politics. You codify a bunch of simple-minded slogans and sound bites, and all you get is mass incarceration. Right. We did some studies that showed, there's one study that said that you start losing the value of incarceration anywhere up, when you get up around 400 per 100,000 population, 400 per 100,000 in jail and prison today. After that, there's very little value. In fact, it starts getting actually counterproductive. And that is, you got so many people in jail, you got so many people with felony records, can't find jobs, you got so many people with raising children from prison, because that's totally dysfunctional. You're using so much of the Department of Justice budget on prisons that aren't doing anything that could have been put to good use, then anything over about 400 per 100,000 is counterproductive. The national average in America is about 700 per 100,000. So, I mean, just wasting money. In fact, 10 states lock up blacks at the rate of almost 4,000 per 100,000. 400 and above, no value, or counterproductive. If you take a community of about 100,000 and just lopped off, got rid of the counterproductive part of the spending, what you're just wasting, that could be in a small city, about a third of the size of Newport News and Hampton. That could be $50 to $100 million. Now, you know what your budget is. What you could do with $50 to $100 million to help young people.
Oh,
Right.
man. Yeah,
I mean, you don't get to, you're not spending the first million. I mean, 50, that the programs and the Youth Promise Act is as much of a process as a program, because the process requires you to first figure out how much are you spending on counterproductive incarceration and teen pregnancy related expenses like Medicaid and social services due to teen pregnancies. Now, because if you reduce incarceration with prevention, early intervention, getting young people on the right track, you can not only reduce crime, you can reduce teen pregnancy, you can reduce dropouts, you can reduce everything. Good prevention programs reduce everything. So what are you wasting? What is your potential savings? And what is your plan to do something about it? Okay. The next step is put a real plan together to show in detail what the plan is. Then that's a complicated process. Part of the process, part of that first step, 2 steps, is nobody has the numbers. How much money is Newport News spending in incarceration? Who knows? I suspect it'll be the same number of digits as a school board budget, maybe not as much, but something along the same lines. And when you toss in expenses generated by teen pregnancies, you'll probably be close to the school board budget. Well, how in the world do you get there? I mean, this is just, and then you look at counterproductive incarceration. Okay, Then you put your plan together. We'll fund the plan once. And then as the plan is implemented, you're going to generate savings. Everybody knows you're going to save a lot of money. So everybody who's saving money that was around the table helping you put the plan together should kick in some of their savings. I mean, the hospital will save money because they're not getting uncompensated care on gunshot wounds because there'll be fewer gunshot wounds. The Department of Corrections will have fewer prisoners coming their way. They ought to kick in some. So you ought to be able to get, if they just kick in a good part of what they're saving, you ought to have enough to keep the programs going. Now, that's the concept in the Youth Promise Act. And the idea, you'd expect in the planning stage about $300,000, and the implementation plan, millions of dollars. And the plan has to be comprehensive, starting with prenatal care, because we know that better prenatal care, you can reduce the number of babies born with mental retardation and learning disabilities. Nurse visits after the baby is born, because we know that the parents, if they have nurse visits, will be much better situated in getting the child off on the right track. Make sure they have early learning opportunities, after school programs. I mean, dropout prevention programs, reading recovery programs, whatever it takes to get them locked into a cradle to college and career, and out of the cradle to prison pipeline. And everybody knows that it works and saves money. You just have to have the political will to make the investment. That's going to be that's when I talked about Joe Biden's plan. I was instrumental in helping put that together. A lot of money will be put into youth programs to get young people on the right track and keep them on the right track. As you said, we passed the Youth Promise Act as part of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, and also as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. That's the what took over No Child Left Behind. We got it there. This administration didn't do anything with it, and no point in arguing with them. Elections have consequences. They are who they are. But if Joe Biden gets in there, I expect a lot of money to go into the Youth Promise Act.
Well, Congressman Scott, we appreciate it. I mean, there are some things I think, I've learned as well, about some of the historical aspect of things, and I'm sure our audience will. We mentioned at the outset about, our appreciation for your support of Hampton Roads Youth Foundation and attending some of our events in the past. I mean, all those things, really, really meant a lot. I mean, for you to take the time out, especially during the summer. So, we've said it to you, privately, but we want to make sure publicly we state so as well. So we really appreciate all the support you've provided thus far.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care. We'll look to speak with you soon.